Racism can cloud judgment, but sometimes karma has a way of making sure justice is served, especially when you least expect it. Today, we'll witness how a young boy's bravery and his father's power turned a humiliating moment into the downfall of a racist gang. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk as Jamal walked home from school. The quiet of the suburban neighborhood should have felt comforting, but today it felt different. Something was coming. He could feel it. Jamal was just 10 years old, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence. His clothes were simple, his backpack a little worn at the edges, but none of that mattered. What mattered was getting home, finishing his homework, and helping his mother before dinner. He didn't ask for much, and he certainly didn't go looking for trouble. But sometimes trouble finds you. Ahead, leaning against a row of bikes, a group of older boys stood laughing. They weren't from his school. He'd seen them before, always lingering near the basketball courts, sneering at kids who walked past. He didn't know their names, but he knew what they were. Trouble. He thought about crossing the street, but it was too late. "Hey, look at this little guy," one of them called out. Jamal kept walking, gripping his backpack straps a little tighter. He knew the rules. Don't engage. Don't react. Just keep moving. But they didn't want to be ignored. A second boy stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Where are you headed, kid?" "Home," Jamal answered, his voice steady. A third boy laughed. "Home? Nah, I don't think so. Not yet." Jamal clenched his jaw. He had heard stories about kids getting jumped, but this was the first time he was in their sights. He knew what they saw. A kid walking alone, smaller than them, easy to push around. They thought he was just another quiet boy who wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. The tallest boy stepped closer. "What's in the bag?" "Nothing for you." That was the wrong answer. Before he could react, one of them yanked his backpack off his shoulders. They expected him to back down, to let them rummage through his things and laugh as he stood there helpless. But Jamal didn't back down. Instead, he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and did something none of them expected. He stepped forward. The gang wasn't used to that. They had bullied kids before, but most of them ran. Most of them begged for their things back. Jamal did neither. He locked eyes with the tallest one and didn't blink. "Give it back," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but there was something in it, something that made the group hesitate. The boy holding his backpack smirked, but it wasn't as confident as before. Or what? Jamal didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The way he stood, the way he didn't flinch, the way he didn't look afraid, it made them uncomfortable. The tallest boy shifted on his feet. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. "Man, let's go," one of the others muttered. "This kid's weird." Jamal didn't move, didn't relax, not until the boy holding his backpack shoved it back into his hands. They left as quickly as they had appeared, but Jamal stayed put, his heart still pounding. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before turning to walk home. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from power, because for the first time he realized something important. He wasn't weak. He wasn't a victim, and no one, not today, not ever, was going to make him feel small again. Jamal had always known that the world saw him differently. In his neighborhood, he was one of the only black kids in a sea of unfamiliar faces. He had spent years walking the same streets, passing by the same people, yet he still felt like an outsider. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken judgment that followed him everywhere. He had learned early on that people like him had to be twice as strong, twice as composed. His mother told him to ignore the whispers, the lingering glances, the subtle ways people tried to make him feel like he didn't belong. His father, always calm and steady, had taught him a different lesson. Respect is earned, not given, his father had told him more than once. And sometimes, the best way to earn it is to show them what real strength looks like. Jamal had carried those words with him, using them like armor against the world. But even armor had its limits. The group that had stopped him today wasn't just any group of kids. They were the kind who had always had everything handed to them. Their families were rich, their futures secured. They had grown up believing they were better than everyone else, not because of anything they had done, but because of the money they came from. For them, life has always been easy, and that ease had made them cruel. They moved in packs, picking their targets carefully, always someone they thought wouldn't fight back. A kid walking alone, someone smaller, someone different. Jamal had seen them before, laughing at others, pushing kids around, taking whatever they wanted just because they could. They weren't used to being challenged. But today, they made a mistake. They had picked the wrong kid. Because while Jamal might have looked like an easy target, there was something about him they didn't know. Jamal's father wasn't just any man. He was a CIA agent, a man trained in strategy, discipline, and survival, a man who had been in war zones, who had faced enemies far more dangerous than a group of entitled teenagers, a man who had taught his son how to read a situation, how to stay calm under pressure, and, if the moment ever called for it, how to stand his ground. Not with fists, with presence. Jamal had grown up listening to his father's stories. He had watched him practice techniques in the backyard and had absorbed the lessons hidden in the way he moved, the way he carried himself. His father had never raised a hand in anger, but there was something about him, an air of quiet control that made people think twice before challenging him. Jamal had inherited that same quiet control. And now, standing face to face with the gang, he realized something important. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they were in charge. They thought they could intimidate him, push him around, make him feel small. But Jamal wasn't small. He never had been. And today, they were about to find that out the hard way. The tallest boy smirked, tossing Jamal's backpack between his hands like it was a game. The others laughed, already moving on, already convinced they had won. Jamal didn't move. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for his things back. He simply took a step forward. The boy, holding his bag, hesitated, just for a second. Jamal saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the first crack in their confidence. He took another step, and another, until he was standing directly in front of them. The laughter faded. The tallest boy shifted his weight, trying to regain control. "What do you think you're gonna do?" he sneered. Jamal didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, studying the boy the way his father had taught him to study an opponent. Not with anger, not with fear, with understanding. Because the truth was, bullies weren't strong. They only knew how to fight battles they had already won. Jamal wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "Give it back," he said quietly. The boy's smirk faltered. He glanced at the others, expecting them to laugh, to back him up. But no one said a word, because something had changed. Jamal wasn't afraid, and that was something they didn't know how to handle. The tallest boy let out a nervous chuckle, tossing the backpack back at Jamal like it meant nothing. "We were just messing with you, man." Jamal caught it without breaking eye contact. They turned and walked away, their bravado shrinking with every step. Jamal didn't move until they were gone. Then, slowly, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Respect is earned, not given. Jamal had just earned his, and he didn't need to throw a single punch to do it. Jamal knew something was wrong the moment he turned the corner. The street, usually quiet at this hour, felt different. He could see them up ahead, a group of teenagers, older, taller, leaning against a brick wall like they owned the world. He had seen them before. They weren't just kids messing around, they were trouble. Jamal tightened his grip on his backpack and kept walking. His father had always told him that ignoring people like them was the best option. Don't engage. Don't react. Walk away. But today, walking away wouldn't be so easy. One of them spotted him first. "Hey, look who it is." The others turned. Jamal felt their eyes lock onto him like a predator spotting prey. He didn't stop walking, didn't speed up, didn't slow down. But they were already moving toward him. "Where do you think you're going?" The tallest one, a boy with sharp blue eyes and a smirk that promised trouble, stepped in front of him. Jamal knew his name, Bryce. He had seen him at school, always surrounded by kids just like him. Kids who had never had to fight for respect. Jamal tried to step around him, but another boy blocked his path. "Not gonna say hi?" Bryce grinned, shoving Jamal's shoulder lightly, testing him. "That's kinda rude, don't you think?" Jamal exhaled slowly. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice even. Bryce laughed. "Oh, you don't want trouble? That's funny, 'cause I heard people like you make trouble." Jamal's stomach tightened. He had heard it before. People like you. He didn't react. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But they weren't done. Another boy, blond and broad-shouldered, stepped closer. "What's in the bag?" Jamal shook his head. "Nothing for you. Nothing for me." The boy scoffed. "Man, you got an attitude." Bryce grabbed the strap of Jamal's backpack. Jamal clenched his jaw. "Don't fight. Don't react." But he wouldn't run either, not this time. He yanked his backpack back, holding onto it tightly. Bryce laughed. "Oh, he thinks he's tough." The others circled closer. Jamal's heart pounded. Not with fear, with frustration, with anger. But he couldn't let that show. That's what they wanted. They wanted him to snap, to yell, to swing first. Because then it wouldn't be their fault. It would be his. Jamal took a breath, slow, controlled, and then he did something they didn't expect. He pulled out his phone. The laughter stopped. "Calling for backup," Bryce sneered. "Who's going to save you?" Jamal ignored him. His fingers dialed quickly. The phone rang once, twice, and then his father's voice, calm and steady as ever, came through the speaker. "Jamal?" Jamal exhaled. "Dad?" That was all he needed to say. There was a pause. Then, "Where are you?" Jamal gave the street name, his voice level. His father didn't ask questions, didn't sound worried, didn't even hesitate. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." Jamal lowered the phone and slid it back into his pocket. Then he looked Bryce right in the eyes and smiled. Bryce's smirk faltered. The others shifted uncomfortably. Jamal saw it. The hesitation, the uncertainty. They weren't scared of him, but they knew what was coming. Jamal's father wasn't just any father. He was a CIA agent, trained, calculated, controlled, and very, very protective of his son. The next few minutes stretched in silence. The gang didn't know what to do. They hadn't expected Jamal to call for help. They had wanted him to get angry, to lash out, to give them a reason. But instead, he had stayed calm, And now the seconds dragged. Every time someone looked down the street expecting a car to pull up, the tension grew. Jamal didn't move, didn't speak, didn't break eye contact. And then, finally, the deep hum of an approaching engine. A sleek black SUV rolled down the street. It came to a slow, deliberate stop at the curb. The door opened, and Jamal's father stepped out. He didn't have to say a word. The air shifted, the presence of a man who carried authority without needing to demand it. Bryce took a step back. Jamal's father met his son's eyes first, scanning him quickly, making sure he was unharmed. Then slowly, he turned to face the gang. His expression was unreadable, controlled, measured. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was quiet, but it carried. No one answered. The silence stretched. The gang of teenagers who had been so sure of themselves moments ago suddenly looked uneasy. Jamal exhaled slowly. He had seen his father like this before, not angry, not aggressive, just in control. His father's sharp eyes swept over the group, scanning each of them like they were pieces of a puzzle he had already solved. Then his gaze landed on Bryce. Jamal saw it, the shift in Bryce's posture, the nervous twitch in his fingers. Bryce had been in control before. Now he wasn't. "You've made a serious mistake," Jamal's father said, his voice even, almost calm. Bryce swallowed. The others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, searching for a way out of the situation. Jamal's father pulled something from his jacket pocket. A badge. Not just any badge. A CIA badge. The gang froze. Jamal saw it in their faces, the flicker of realization, the panic creeping in. This wasn't just some random dad. This was a man of power, a man who could make things very difficult for them, a man who had connections, the kind that didn't just let things go. "You've been bullying my son," Jamal's father continued, his voice steady. "And, from what I can tell, that's not all you've been up to." Bryce tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Jamal's father turned slightly, pulling his phone from his pocket. He pressed a button. A police siren echoed in the distance. The gang collectively tensed. "You're not just kids messing around, are you?" Jamal's father continued, his voice casual, but with an edge that made Bryce flinch. "I did a little digging on my way here. Turns out there have been reports." Silence. Jamal watched as the gang's confidence crumbled. His father knew about the vandalism, knew about the stolen property, knew about the threats they had made to others in the neighborhood. Jamal had heard the rumors. But now it was all catching up to them. Bryce took a step back, then another, and then he turned to run, but it was too late. 2 police cars came to a screeching halt at the curb. Uniformed officers stepped out, eyes locked on the group. Bryce stopped in his tracks, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The others? They didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even try to deny it. They knew. One by one, officers approached them. One by one, the gang was pulled aside, questioned, handcuffed. Jamal watched, feeling something shift inside him. Not satisfaction, not victory, just justice. He wasn't the one being blamed this time. He wasn't the one being accused. For the first time, the truth had been seen, and it mattered. His father turned to him, eyes searching his face. "Are you okay?" Jamal nodded. His father placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance. Then he turned back to the officers. "I have evidence," he said simply. Bryce, still standing between 2 officers, finally found his voice. "It was just a joke," he blurted out, desperation creeping in. "We weren't going to do anything serious." Jamal's father tilted his head slightly. A joke? Bryce nodded quickly. Yeah, just messing around. So, the thefts, the vandalism, the anonymous threats sent to students online. Bryce's mouth snapped shut. Jamal's father stepped forward. You come from privilege, he said, his voice carrying weight. You think that gives you power, that you can get away with whatever you want. Silence. You're about to learn otherwise. Bryce looked like he wanted to disappear. Jamal watched as the officers led him and his friends to the patrol cars. His father sighed, shaking his head. Then he turned to Jamal. You handled this well, he said. Jamal swallowed. I tried. His father smiled, the tension softening. You did more than try. You stayed calm. You didn't give them what they wanted. Jamal looked at the police cars, their flashing lights reflecting off the pavement. They won't get away with it this time, he said quietly. No, his father agreed. They won't. A long pause. Then, come on, his father said, ruffling Jamal's hair. Let's go home. And for the first time that day, Jamal felt safe. Jamal stood on the sidewalk watching as the last of the police cars pulled away. The street, which had once felt like a battlefield, was now eerily quiet. The gang was gone. For the first time, they hadn't gotten away with it. Jamal exhaled, feeling the weight of everything settle inside him. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even relieved. What he felt was something else. Something quieter. Something stronger. It wasn't joy. It wasn't victory. It was pride. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that made you puff out your chest and celebrate. It was the kind that sat deep in your bones, the kind that told you that you had done something that mattered. Jamal turned to his father. His father, ever composed, met his gaze and nodded. You did well, he said. Jamal swallowed. He had spent so much of his life being told to ignore it, to let it go, to stay out of trouble. But this time he had stood his ground, not with anger, not with violence, but with strength, real strength. And in doing so, he had changed something. His father glanced toward the end of the street, where a small group of neighbors had gathered, whispering amongst themselves. The story was already spreading. Jamal's name was on their lips, not in pity, not in fear, but in respect. A quiet ripple was moving through the community. People who had once looked the other way were now paying attention, because tonight something had shifted. And that shift? It wasn't just about Jamal. It was about all the kids like him. The ones who had been bullied, the ones who had been threatened, the ones who had been told they weren't enough. They would hear this story. They would see that it was possible, that standing tall could lead to justice. And that was enough. Jamal's father placed a firm hand on his shoulder. They'll never touch you again, he said. Jamal nodded. He knew it was true, but this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something that even the gang, for all their money and cruelty, couldn't stop. Because hate? It only had power if people let it. And tonight, they had taken that power back. Across town, the billionaire sat in his office, staring at the screen in front of him. His hands clenched into fists. His own son, arrested, exposed. His empire, his carefully curated legacy, now tainted by a scandal that would follow him for years. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a reckoning. And for the first time he was forced to see it. To see what had been there all along. The entitlement, the unchecked cruelty, the privilege that had shielded them for so long. But not anymore. Not after tonight. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. A statement a public apology. He didn't want to do it. He hated that he had to do it. But the pressure was mounting. The world was watching. And more than that, his own people, his own community were watching. If he didn't speak out now, he would be swallowed whole by the backlash. His name would be tarnished beyond repair. So, with slow, reluctant movements, he began to type. The next morning, Jamal's story was everywhere. Not just in the community, not just on social media. Everywhere, news outlets covered it. Headlines were plastered with words like justice, bravery, change. Jamal Davis, the boy who had stood his ground, the boy who had dismantled a system in a single night. And the billionaire? His statement was already viral, an apology, a pledge to fund initiatives against bullying, a promise to use his wealth to fix what had been broken. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the news. His father leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, watching him. "You proud of yourself?" he asked. Jamal hesitated, then slowly he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." His father smiled. "Good." A long pause. Then, "What now?" Jamal asked. His father set down his cup. "Now," he said, "now we keep moving forward." Jamal looked back down at the screen, at his name, at his story, at the hundreds, no, thousands of people commenting, sharing, spreading the word. The impact was already there, and he knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. Because change, real change, it didn't happen overnight. But tonight had been a step, and that was everything. The night had passed, but the impact of Jamal's actions would last far beyond those few critical moments. This wasn't just about standing up to bullies. This was about change, real change, the kind that forced people to look closer, to listen, to see what had been ignored for too long. Jamal had not just stood up for himself, he had stood up for every child who had ever been made to feel small, for every person who had been silenced by fear, for every voice that had been told it didn't matter. And in doing so, he had proven them wrong. The next morning, the world knew his name. The news cycle was relentless. Social media erupted with discussions about racism, privilege, and justice. Jamal's story wasn't just a headline, it was a movement. People saw themselves in him. Some saw their past, some saw their present, and some saw what they needed to do next. But for Jamal, life continued. He still had to go to school. He still had homework to do. He still had to wake up the next morning and live. Only now, he did so with the knowledge that he had made a difference. And that was everything. Across town, the billionaire sat in his office, scrolling through the backlash his son's arrest had created. The world had turned against him, demanding accountability. And for the first time, he had no way to buy his way out of it. His empire had been built on power, wealth, and control. But tonight, all of that had been overshadowed by the actions of a 10-year-old boy. A boy he would have never looked at twice. A boy who had just changed everything. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Not anger, not pride, but shame. Because deep down, he knew Jamal wasn't the problem. He was. And now the world was watching, waiting to see if he would finally do the right thing. That afternoon, as Jamal walked home, his father beside him, he noticed something different. People looked at him differently. Not with pity, not with doubt, but with respect. His father placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You ready for what comes next?" Jamal met his gaze. He knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of more conversations, more change, more fights that would have to be won. And he wasn't afraid. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." Jamal's bravery was never just about standing up to bullies. It was about proving that one act of courage could change the course of everything. It was about showing that strength didn't come from wealth, status, or intimidation. It came from standing tall in the face of injustice. It came from believing that no matter how small your voice, it still mattered. And most importantly, it came from never backing down. Jamal had changed more than just his own life that night. He had changed the conversation. He had forced people to look at themselves and ask, "What do I stand for? What do I allow? What will I do next time I see injustice?" Because this was only the beginning. And that was how the world truly changed.